Commercial real estate continues to boom here in Charleston. Today, I talk one-on-one with Ashley Jackrel, the Vice President of Office and Investment Services for Avison Young, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Ashley Jackrel, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I know that you are the Vice President of Office and Investment Services at Avison Young. You are a USAF Honorary Commander and, of course, a Realtor. What is it like to be you these days?
It's a little crazy. I actually just flew in last night from Chicago. Wow. I was at the National Association of Realtors Leadership Camp preparing for 2024. We are going to have an amazing year. I'll be chairing the commercial committee for the National Association this coming year. So just got back from some training for that, and for the rest of the year, basically every 5 or 6 weeks, I'll be conferencing, which is great networking, wonderful for the business, but also giving back to our industry and to our communities as well.
What is the industry today?
You know, I think if you ask different people in different sectors, you're going to get different answers, and of course, different parts of the country. So we're very blessed to be in Charleston for so many reasons, especially with our team being office specialists. You hear oftentimes about the flight to quality and how these different primary markets like New York and LA and Chicago have just completely been eviscerated, and nobody's coming back to the office. I was reading a McKinsey Institute report the other day about how certain neighborhoods, for example, the financial district in New York City, because there was no diversity in that district, that it's been even worsely impacted than some of the other areas of primary markets. And so thankfully in Charleston, you know, for better for worse, people, I feel like, are back in the office more than in other areas, and we also have a really diverse community, diverse downtown. We don't really even have a central business district. I wouldn't say, you know, if anything, we're in the heart of it here with the courthouse, you know, which business as usual. So I think that diversity has really allowed us, particularly in the office market, which is my specialty, to continue to be successful.
So, and this is probably a redundant question, but what's new, what's right now with the Charleston commercial real estate industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that flight to quality. So what we're seeing is as leases expire, most tenants are not in the space that they need. So whether they need, most of them, less space, some of them, they need the same amount of space, but they need it to serve them a little differently. So they need a different floor plan.
Oh, yes.
We still have some businesses that are growing. You know, so we do have people who are getting into larger spaces, which is great. But most people are downsizing or, you know, right-sizing, as we might refer to it. But they're getting a different floor plan that might serve their employees better and better encourage them to return to the office. But they're also looking at places that have amenities that are nearby, so that when they do make the commitment to come to the office, they're also making an appointment to have a happy hour, to go out for lunch, to meet a client, to, you know, collaborate with a peer. And so we're definitely seeing that quality is very important when people are making new decisions about their leased space.
So in the past 6 months, Ashley, how many leases have actually expired?
Oh gosh, I don't know that number off the top of my head. I'm sure we could track that down in some way, shape, or form. Our team has done quite a few leases this year, more than normal actually. So we are typically somewhere in the 60 to 80 transactions a year on our team. And as of the end of July, we were already at 54 transactions. So we're definitely outpacing. You know, we don't know what the end of the year holds, but within our team, we've definitely seen an uptick. We're outpacing year over year each of the last 3 years that I've been with Avison Young and with this team. So it's been a busy market we have been experiencing.
And what is your forecast for the end of the year?
I think we're going to continue seeing a lot of what we've seen for the first half of the year. You know, I've focused so far our conversation on leasing because that's where we're having still a lot of transactional velocity. So Still keeping the wheels turning. Obviously, capital market space, so sales, because of what's happening in the interest rate environment, that has completely come to a screeching halt. So while we continue having lease transactions, sale transactions not so much. So I think that over the back half of the year, we'll probably start to see a little bit more potential. We've already seen some increases in concessions. So landlords are giving more free rent. They are bending on certain terms, not necessarily rent. We haven't seen rent compression yet. But I think that's probably coming down the pipe as we have readjustments in pricing because of the interest rate environment. So I don't know if that's going to happen in the next 6 months, and a lot of that also has to do with inventory and availability, which is something that in Charleston we are still fairly limited in, both commercially as well as residentially, as we all know. So I think that time will tell, obviously, but if I had to guess, I would say eventually we're going to see even more concessions and probably a little bit of the tightening on the rents, which will be a relief.
And where do you see those rents tightening exactly here in the Charleston area?
I think you're going to see that more in the B and C areas. So, for example, we're meeting downtown, right next to the courthouse, and we've got a lot of really beautiful buildings in the area. Notably, we've got the Morrison Yard project, which is, I think, just shy of 90% leased at this point. So, a new product came during the COVID era, and they're almost full. And I think that speaks to what I was mentioning earlier with the flight to quality. So they have an amazing view. They've got wonderful amenities nearby. They're convenient right at the base of the bridge. So they have a lot of things going for them. But a lot of the leases that have been signed there are shifts within our marketplace. They're not necessarily new to our market. So where did they move from? Well, they moved from those places that we're talking about that don't have those things. So they don't necessarily have walkable amenities. They don't have a view. You might have to get in your car to go grab lunch. And so people are going to be less incentivized to come to the office, because if you're just going to drive somewhere to sit and work, well, I could do that at home. I don't need to get in my car to do that. So I think that we're going to see more of the shift happening in those B and C markets. Places like, for example, Leeds Avenue.
Oh, yes.
That's a perfect example, because there's, you're on an island there. You have a lot of office users, but no amenities. You definitely have to get in your car to get anything.
Yes.
So I think that over time there's going to be that shift, but it's going to take some time. I mean, things don't happen nearly as quickly in commercial as in residential, and so it takes time to see the impacts of what's happening in the economy to rents and incentives and things like that.
And what type of incentives are they getting right now?
Free rent periods.
Right.
So you get a little bit more time maybe to move your team in. If you need any changes to the floor plan, if you need new finishes, maybe you get a little bit more time to complete those. And so, you get your project done and you moved in, but you're still in your free rent period.
Yeah.
Well, that's great as a tenant.
Yes.
The other thing is maybe the landlord is willing to kick in a few dollars for tenant improvement allowance, whereas they might not have previously. So landlords are definitely incentivized to keep their buildings full, because if they have a refinance, if their note is coming due in the next 18 to 24 months, they're concerned about making sure that they have tenants in their building.
Wow. And what is the interest rate right now for those areas?
So interest rates are determined by each individual purchaser, but if I were to just kind of off the top of my head give you a rough idea of what interest rates are now for commercial real estate, we're looking at in the 7 to 8% range, whereas a couple years ago, I mean, even at the beginning of COVID, we were sub threes for certain user. And so when your interest rates double, as they have, certainly that it impacts buying decisions, both for owner occupants and for investors.
So how many owner occupants do you have, and how many investors do you have right now in this area?
We are definitely working with more users. So the types of businesses that are going to be leasing spaces. Owner occupants are in the marketplace because as their businesses have been successful and grown through COVID and in the aftermath, they have realized that prices are going up, and so they want to own and control their real estate. At the same time, their inventory choices are minimal, so there's not a lot of space out there for smaller users to purchase, and so there is a lot of competition in that space.
Wow.
So, and this is where, like, when you have the conversation at a high level, we talk about, well, sales have completely halted, which is true at a macro level. We have leading companies that are, down 70 and 90% year over year in their capital market space, so their sales. At the same time, the smaller businesses, it's business as usual for most of them, and so they continue to make those decisions. To give you a great example, we've got a property that's under contract right now in North Charleston. It was ripe for redevelopment. It's under contract with an owner-occupant who's going to do that redevelopment, and I'm extremely excited for what that's going to bring to the block and to the neighborhood. And we were under contract. We had multiple offers within the first 2 days, and we accepted one in the first week. And so, that's very unusual for commercial real estate when the transaction time frame is usually more like 6 months. But I think that's a great example of how when you get into a very specific space, the market can look very different than what you're hearing in the news.
Wow. So what is the biggest difference from what you're hearing in the news and what's reality?
I think that at a high level, we continue to hear that the sky is falling, and we are going to see some adjustments to the market. There's no doubt about that.
Yes, ma'am.
But I think that in Charleston, like I said, businesses keep on trucking, and we have so many wonderful things going for us. And so, this property that we have under contract is such a wonderful example of how business decisions are still being made, and people are still committing to purchasing property. They're still committing to do the redevelopment, even though construction prices are still really high. So I think that's a really good example of how when you get into the nuts and bolts of finding space for someone who needs it, that the reality of what's available in our marketplace is very different from what you might think when you hear the news saying the sky is falling, nothing is selling, so you think, oh, there must be so many options for me to choose from, and then you go out and try to buy property and you realize that's not at all the case. So I think that's probably the best example that I could think of how when we really get down to what we do on a day-to-day basis, that it's different from what we hear in the news cycle.
So in this particular area of Charleston, how many people are actually involved with redevelopment?
We have a tight group. I think there are a handful of companies that come to mind off the top of my head. But then you also have smaller, if I were to make the parallel to residential, because I think a lot more people are familiar with residential real estate than commercial real estate. So just like in residential real estate, you think of like Pulte and Lennar, and you've got the big developers like that, but then you also have the mom and pop shops. It's similar in commercial where you have both. And so we've got the big names, but we've also got the individuals who do the smaller projects as well.
So how many of those people are actually doing those smaller projects?
It's the smaller projects that are still happening because the scale is such that you can still tolerate the risk. It's when you get into the larger projects that all of a sudden your funding might have evaporated because of what's happened in the interest rate environment, and so your lender might have said, this no longer works because previously your margins were this, and now that your interest rate has doubled, you have no margin. And so this is no longer a viable project. And so that will be interesting to see, and you asked your question earlier about the next 6 months, what's that going to hold?
Yes, ma'am.
And because things happen so much more slowly in commercial, I don't think we'll have a drastic shift in 6 months. But if I were to think about what happens 24 months from now, we're not going to have large new building announcements, I would guess, because of the restrictions on funding. At the same time, you have tenants who are going to be competing for the highest quality spaces. So I think that there's a possibility that even though we might have some submarkets that have large shifts in their rental rates, I think we might have other markets that are improving, and meaning rents are staying the same or even increasing because tenants crave that quality space, and we don't have the inventory. So that shift, and that is getting into the submarket level, right? We're talking about, like in my example earlier, comparing Leeds Avenue to the neck area of downtown Charleston, where you might have completely different scenarios for those two areas.
Yeah, you're right about that. So where do you see the rental rates heading in the next 6 months?
I think we're going to mostly have fairly flat rates, rental asking rates in the next 6 months. Slight compression in certain areas. We're not going to see that in the neck area because, as I just mentioned, inventory is limited. You have a lot of competition.
Oh, yes.
But I think in those submarkets that are going to become the value play, so for companies who are not necessarily able to compete for those Class A brand new spaces that have the amenities,
that's right.
Those submarkets might have compression starting in the next 6 months.
Where do you see the high quality space going elsewhere in the Charleston area?
The neck area has been very popular for a lot of reasons.
I've seen that.
Obviously, you have the water, the view, the proximity to all the amenities, but then also the convenience of it being very centrally located. So when you think about Mount Pleasant, we have some really beautiful space over there too, and I think we'll have more of that coming. That is a little bit more tricky if you have people coming from West Ashley, James Island, Johns Island, because now you have to come all the way across the crosstown. So as an employer, there's a benefit to paying a few extra dollars a foot to be downtown and be centrally located because you can capture a larger employment base.
Okay, so what is that employment base right now?
Well, we have the lowest unemployment rate that I think we've ever had in the Charleston market right now. So I think that's a struggle for most employers competing for employees, and that parlays into what we were talking about with having amenitized space.
Yes, ma'am.
Because employees have the ability to choose to work in a quality environment, and they want that. If they're going to be forced to come to the office, it better be pretty, it better be amenitized, there's going to be coffee in the lobby. We want all of those things because we've gotten used to being in the comfort of our own home. And so we want our office space to mimic that in so many ways. And it needs to be comfortable and inviting. And so employers are looking at that in a way that they have not, and maybe ever. And I think that's refreshing, that we have employers thinking about the quality of the space that their employees are going to be working in. But there's so many ways that employers need to compete for talent. And office space is one of them.
Wow. Okay, I want to go back to what you said earlier too about the margins. What are those margins for the redevelopment area?
So it varies by project, and so I wouldn't really be able to give you a margin that would be specific to a project. A developer might be willing to tell you what their margin was, but they might say that's a trade secret. I don't know.
Right.
And so I think that obviously, anytime you're going to assume the risk of doing a massive project like that, there has to be a payoff at the end, right? Because you are assuming risk. And when I think about projects like Morrison Yard, where they kicked off before COVID, and we didn't really know how that was going to play out, and it turned out to work out great for that project and for many around the Charleston market. And it could have gone very differently, but I think because we're Charleston and we have so many wonderful things going for us, it did work out well. And just kind of going back to that diversity and the fact that we have such a beautiful community and people do want to live here. And there's, I think, a lot that we need to keep in mind to both protect that and protect that character, and at the same time accommodate the people who want to live here, because let's face it, we can't close the gates behind us, right? Even if we could, we would continue to grow as a community. And so if we don't figure out how to accommodate those people in an efficient way, then we're going to have negative impacts from that. And so I think that's something that we should continue to be really mindful of.
This is probably a politician question, Ms. Ashley. But how does Charleston grow with smart growth?
Yeah, I think that one of the things the Realtors Organization in particular is a proponent of, you mentioned the smart growth. So we need vibrant, sustainable, resilient communities, and obviously sea level rise is something that we struggle with here. We have stormwater. There are a lot of things from an infrastructure standpoint that we need to be cognizant of. At the same time, if you think about it, there are a certain number of people who are going to move here, and whether we put that here or there, they're coming, right? And so there's this concept of how do we get people efficiently living in spaces that have infrastructure already. So if you think about, let's say for example, the neck area of Charleston, where we have 526, 26, we've got places where people can get in and out quickly and easily. Higher ground, you have, in my opinion, kind of blighted industrial areas that could be transitioned into vibrant, livable communities. And you could get a lot of people living in a tight space, which is not necessarily something that people find appealing when you hear that said out loud. And at the same time, the alternative is that all of those people go live somewhere else. And then they have to drive. And so you create such a larger impact by having more sprawl. You need more infrastructure because people are all spread out in the areas where they can afford to live. And so it's a struggle when you have community members saying enough is enough, and they're saying that because we haven't made the infrastructure improvements that we need to. We haven't dedicated that funding and in order to keep up with the growth of our community. And so that is important. And at the same time, if we just say no more, then the reality is that what's allowed to be built right now are those communities and neighborhoods that are further out. And if we continue to build out and out and out, then we're going to gobble up all of the beautiful things that we have as a community. We're going to further strain our resources because of all the infrastructure that we need. And so in so many ways, not only in our community, but in communities across the country, the answer is infill development. How do we get more people in the area where the infrastructure is already located? Because even though people who live here now might not want to live in those areas, under those circumstances, whatever the case may be, there are a lot of people who do want that and want smaller units and more units per acre and to live in a tighter community, because if you have more people in a smaller amount of space, you also have more amenities. You have a more walkable community.
Sure.
I live up near Hampton Park, and so we have, we're so blessed to be able to walk to some of the best restaurants in Charleston. And I don't know if I'll ever move, because I'm like, okay, I'll live in this 3-block radius and I want this much square footage and this many bathrooms, and basically it doesn't exist because I don't have that kind of money anymore. But I bought well is what I'm saying. And so I think that we do need to be mindful that we think at a macro level about how we accommodate, because if we just think about individually what we want and we don't think about how we accommodate the people who are moving here, how we commit to having infrastructure that we need, then I think that we're going to wind up with a less than ideal result, unfortunately. So I think we need to think big picture.
And when you think about that big picture right now, when you look at obviously the redevelopment and the areas that you have all these clients in right now, where exactly are the infrastructure improvements needed?
Oh gosh, that is one heck of a question, Quintin. We need a lot of things, right? So we have the project over at the hospital district that's going to be coming online, which is fantastic. The new Cooper Hotel, that improved the infrastructure along Queen Street and the drainage infrastructure there. So that's an example of how development actually helped us to obtain that infrastructure, both repairing some existing and adding to it. We need the wall, because because what happens when another major storm event comes through and the peninsula of Charleston is underwater? You know, there are irreplaceable assets in the historic district, and you know, you can't just rebuild certain things. And so I think we do need to figure out a way to make that work, and I think some of that means we need to increase our tax basis. Because if you just tell the citizens of Charleston, well, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for $1 billion project, well, that's not realistic. But when you can leverage federal funds, increase tax base, all of a sudden it becomes much more realistic. And I think that that's something that, not just for Charleston, but for you know, the world, really, we've got to be thinking more proactively about environmental impacts as well, because you know, we just saw what happened in Maui, and these events are unfortunately no longer one-off events. You know, we see the wildfires year after year, the storm events get worse and worse, and so I think that we need to know that those are going to happen eventually. And so instead of, you know, being caught off guard when they happen, let's be prepared. Let's know that that's going to happen. Let's have some emergency funding set aside. So, you know, I'm getting off in the weeds here a bit, but I think that we have to think big picture in order to accomplish those goals. And if we just think about, well, I don't want that project next to me, then we're not going to get there.
Besides the historic district, Ms. Ashley, where exactly else on the peninsula and in Charleston really can we increase the tax base right now?
I think that the neck is a great opportunity. You know, it's still technically peninsula, although not historic district. So I think there's a ton of opportunity there. You know, I get a little worried about places like Johns Island, right, where you have a ton of land, you have the ability to entitle large neighborhoods, and that's happening because it's still affordable. But then you have all those people sitting on those roads. You know, if we have another storm event, you only have 2 ways off the island. You know, there's a lot of concerns about what that means when you put that many people in an area like that. That has historically been rural. And how do you protect that rural character? Well, you have to give those people somewhere else to buy affordably.
Where is the affordability in Johns Island? I'm like, oh Lord.
Well, it's certainly more affordable than where we're sitting today.
Of course, yeah.
But you know, it is one of the more affordable submarkets still throughout the area. And not practicing residential, I don't have the medians off the top of my head. But when you compare, let's say, you know, Johns Island to downtown Charleston, obviously no comparison at all. You know, Mount Pleasant, I want to say their median is up in the 800,000s now, which, you know, if you think about a couple who's a young professional, maybe they just got married and they're starting their career, like, that's not affordable, even if they have really good jobs. And so it's difficult. You know, Mount Pleasant, obviously, they've had a moratorium on multifamily for several years, and so there is no inventory to support those first-time buyers because they haven't built it in many years. Thankfully, we don't have that moratorium, but there still are some zoning restrictions that keep us from building more compact, and compact does mean more affordable, because if you can get more units in a, you know, footprint, then that makes it less expensive. That's just how it works. But we're not allowed to build things below a certain size or below a certain number per acre. And when I talk to my my honorary commander pairing at Joint Base Charleston, you know, they tell me we need more affordable housing. We don't need these beautiful sprawling 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom houses with, you know, the granite countertops. We need townhomes that are, you know, just the basic grade cabinetry and nothing fancy. We just need it to be affordable. And the challenge is that in order to build that type of, you know, even townhomes are considered to be dense, right? It's much more challenging than doing a single family neighborhood. And so we have to change the zoning code to allow for that if we're going to really tackle this affordability, because it's a supply and demand issue, right? We just need more units. That's the heart of how you drive down the cost of housing, is you get more housing.
Yes.
And so how do we make that happen in a way that is smart, that is resilient, that is sustainable? It's not going to make a lot of people happy, because people just think about, well, I don't want that many people living next to me, right? And so I think as we approach this conversation about rezoning in the city of Charleston, and something that hasn't been done in 100 years, I think that's really important for us to think about, like, what this community could look like in another 100 years, based off of our present growth, and anticipating that will continue. And if we don't make these changes, what that's going to mean for sprawl, and to me, the loss of some rural character that we should be protecting.
Where exactly is that inventory? Well, where ideally could the inventory be on Johns Island?
Johns Island is a tough one. The Realtors Association was involved in the Dutch Dialogues project, and so they looked at, what's the high ground, and how do we incentivize growth on the high ground where it can be resilient and sustainable. And so I think that encouraging the building to be on that high ground, for me personally, I'm very much like, let's get it all on the growth corridor. Like, let's encourage transit-oriented development. We're going to have bus rapid transit, low country rapid transit,
Sure.
Running between Charleston and Somerville. Like, let's get more people close to that, where we can get them up and down, and we can have more people along that transit line, and therefore more amenities along the transit line. We can create more walkable communities. We can have less reliance on vehicles. And so if I were to think, like, gosh, in 30 or 40 years, like, what do I want it to look like? I think that would be fantastic to have that density along that core, of 26 and 52, and where we're going to have the low country rapid transit, and have fewer cars on the road, and more people walking within their neighborhoods to enjoy meals and shopping, and hopefully fewer carbon emissions and a healthier planet.
Well,
lofty goals.
Lofty goals. There you go. Well, Ashley Jackrel, thank you so much for your time, and again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks for having me, Quintin.
Oh, you're very welcome.